Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Monday, February 24th, 2025. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine. With me, as always, Executive Editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Washington commentary columnist and Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, Matthew Continetti. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John.
And Matt's colleague at AEI, our social commentary columnist, Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
So watching clips from the Sunday shows, I did not watch the Sunday shows because I am not, in fact, a masochist. I saw Mike Waltz, Pete Hegseth, and Steve Witkoff all having to deal with the question of being asked by anchors who started the war in Ukraine because of Donald Trump saying that you should never start the war, saying that to Zelensky, and all of them having to twist themselves into pretzels. Witkoff, the most interesting because he is the least experienced in terms of foreign policy and seems to know the least, effectively endorsing a very, very radical view that to and very much a species of the right, the isolationist right, that Russia was goaded into the war because Ukraine wanted to be in NATO and that it was defensive. Russia, whatever was the case of Russia, somehow was defending itself against NATO. So how could you accuse it of having started the war? Which is interesting because I'm sure this is a subject that he literally hasn't given a second's thought to in his entire life until last week.
Well, John, he also, in one of the interviews, said that he had a 3-hour meeting with Vladimir Putin. So
yeah,
I'm sure he
got
learned about the subject from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
From Kievan Rus to Novorossiya to all kinds of things. Anyway, Mike Waltz saying the situation, who would you want on that wall? You want Donald Trump on that wall. You don't want any wimpy Biden people on that wall, which was his way of deflecting it. And then Pete Hegseth saying the situation is very complicated. So it occurs to me, I wanted to posit this, that having to harmonize your view with Trump's outburst at the press conference, in which I think probably mistakenly, to be honest, he got himself twisted up in knots and said, you should never have started this war, to Zelensky, which I sort of think he didn't actually mean to say. Genuinely, it doesn't comport with other things that he has said. He's only said he wanted to end the war and that there's too much death. And then having to double down on it when everybody went, oh, how could you possibly say such a thing? And Zelensky saying he's falling prey to in the world of disinformation. He has now forced these officials to harmonize their views with his, this not even necessarily really being a view of his, and that this is now the second term or the first term equivalent of the crowd size talk at the beginning of 2021, and how, yes, this was the largest crowd in the history of an inauguration. We all know that was not the case, could not possibly have been the case because of COVID, among other things. But Sean Spicer and others were sort of compelled to live within this reality distortion bubble. But of course, this is vastly more serious and has vastly larger ramifications, including historical ramifications, that we have the entire administration endorsing this view that, as I say, could very well have been Trump kind of getting, it was 4:00 in the afternoon, it's late, he's been up, it's the board, a lot of stuff going on, and maybe made a big mistake, and now this has now become the major foreign policy controversy of his administration.
You know the George Costanza line, it's not a lie if you believe it. I think that is true in this case more so than in the crowd size case, where obviously the photographic evidence just showed that there had been larger crowds at previous inaugurations than the one in 2017. The Trump administration, and I think Donald Trump himself, after conversations with Putin and with Tucker Carlson, has come to the view that the reason Putin invaded was that America has engaged in a flawed foreign policy toward Ukraine for decades, and that the root of this conflict is in the Bush administration's offering of a membership action plan to Ukraine and the Republic of Georgia in 2008. And so all the things that we've heard from Tucker Carlson, from the technologist David Sachs, from Elon Musk over the past 3 years, since today now marks the third anniversary of the beginning of this phase of the war, the direct invasion of Ukraine by Russia, is now, it seems to me, administration policy. And that's why these folks who were on the Sunday shows didn't bring themselves to say that Russia started the war, because they believe in this concept that the West basically pushed Russia into invading in 2024. I don't agree with it, but I think this is where we're getting, the administration has lined up. And I think Carlson's hand shouldn't be ignored here. You know, he's seems to be spending a lot of time in the Gulf these days, but that doesn't preclude him from calling his friend Donald Trump. And it's certainly the case that J.D. Vance has been on the record about Ukraine since the very beginning, saying he doesn't care what happened in Ukraine. He told the Munich conference that the enemy within Europe is much more important than the threat from Russia or China. So This is where they are, and we're entering a period where we really have no idea.
I just think.
Can I just add that I think it's more like, it's less like the crowd size first term Trump than it is Sharpie and the hurricane moment Trump, where he had a kind of a vague idea of something. He was wrong about it. He spouted off, but then he doubled down when criticized, and so got out the Sharpie and kind of tried to will into reality something that an actual hurricane, and everyone around him played along. The problem is now he's got a Sharpie out on the borders of Europe, and he's drawing all these lines. And I was struck with a lot of the comments, both of his supporters and listening to some of what was going on at CPAC this weekend. He is perhaps the most historically illiterate president we've had since Joe Biden, who was also historically illiterate.
So and basically, since December.
Right. But there's a certain kind of historical illiteracy in that he has sort of vague moods about the past that are informed, as Matt's correct to point out, by people like Tucker Carlson who cosplay at being historians. So there's sort of a double danger there in terms of his understanding, not just of the current moment in foreign affairs, but of our recent and the last 50 to 100 years in Europe.
Okay, so can I just add my 2 cents here?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that Trump believes that Ukraine started the war. I'm more sure that he doesn't care. I think he primarily wanted to, quote, end the war on his term, during his term, to say that the war had stopped as long as he was in office, and that the Tucker, Vance, etc. theory of the case was at hand and could be used and had support among MAGA. So he's going with that.
Okay. If you listen to the moment when he said you should never have started it line, I've watched it 3 or 4 times over the weekend, and he really, it was a kind of it wasn't a slip, but it was a kind of, what you call it, like an improv, sort of like someone blathering, and that's why I say it's interesting that he went this way, and now it's become administration policy to say that Ukraine started the war with Russia.
Well, the policy is we don't know who started the war. That was the line.
Well, but that's where it's gone. Because right. that's where over the weekend it's like it doesn't matter who started the war.
Higgs said it's very complicated.
It's very complicated,
which is true.
But okay, it's not that complicated. Russia started the war. It's not complicated at all.
David Goldman, history of Europe.
David Goldman, formerly known as Spengler, this very brilliant, very eccentric, very odd commentator on world affairs for the last 20, 25 years, said, while it is nominally true that Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, the story is more complicated. This is not Fort Sumter. This was not that the Ukrainians were, we're standing around waiting for their antagonist to fire on Ukraine so that they could get in the war. They were spared Kyiv being basically being overrun by Russian tanks by the mud of late winter, on the road from Russia to Kyiv, where they really didn't have much opportunity to stop the Russians. It was sort of like one of those contingent moments in all of history. I don't really want to relitigate this, except to say that where Christine talks about cosplaying history, there is a bifurcated fact here. In 1993, it was the policy of the United States, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, that we wanted to do what we could to denuclearize the countries of the Cold War. And Ukraine, on its territory, were thousands of nuclear weapons. And we convinced Ukraine to disarm itself unilaterally in exchange for security guarantees that the Russians would not be permitted to take over Ukraine. Now, in 1993, it looked like the Russians couldn't take over, a 7-Eleven. So how are they going to take over Ukraine? But 30 years later, in fact, there was Russia resurgent, having taken 2 bites out of Ukraine in the previous 15 years, or the previous 10 years, the Donbass and Crimea. And so they were staying there saying, if we had just not listened to you and kept our nuclear weapons, none of this would have happened. Therefore, you got to stick to your deal. This was something you wanted from us. We didn't have any particular national interest in giving up our nuclear. This was a gesture that we wanted to be part of the community of Western nations. And so we did this for you. And now it's 3 years after.
Well, John, hold on.
Okay.
Who broke that agreement? Not Donald Trump. Barack Obama did in 2014.
Fair enough.
So
we've talked a lot about that. So I'm not saying he didn't break it and that he didn't, but there's a lot about Barack Obama's foreign policy that Donald Trump reversed in his first term, and theoretically in this term, and this could have been one of the things.
He's reversing the Biden policy of support to Ukraine,
right? But I'm saying, in the larger historical sense, the United States made a promise that, on a very large scale, for a country that had defensive weapons. Now, very complicated figure in American foreign policy thinking, John Mearsheimer, professor of government, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel thinker, but a very, very hardline realist for many decades, and a believer. He said, as understanding how the world really works, that it would be wise for countries, as he said in the late 70s, early 80s, to proliferate in nuclear fashion in order to protect themselves against each other. This was not a widely held view, but it was sort of like, if you were going to be a realist, and a hard realist, you would say, well, if I were advising a second-tier country, maybe they should get a nuclear weapon, it'll spare them. And he said in 1993 that Ukraine was might be making a mistake giving up its nuclear weapons. He is now one of the foremost expostulators of the idea that Russia, feeling horrible pressure from NATO and the threat of NATO, was justified in the categorical sense of defending its national interest in invading Ukraine. Because if it didn't, then Ukraine would become NATO. Its perimeter would be surrounded by hostile countries, and therefore it was right in, not in a moral sense, but in a practical sense, to invade Ukraine. His thinking very influential among the neo-isolationists. But if you were to follow the logic of what Mearsheimer said 30 years ago, instead of what he said about NATO lately, it was Ukraine blew it by giving up its nuclear deterrent. It did so on the understanding that the West would not allow it to be swallowed up by a resurgent Russia at some point in the future. That is what's happening, and Mearsheimer disciples are saluting it and celebrating it even. So these are the ironies of history when you don't cosplay history, but you kind of pay attention to it and have some memory of how it functioned.
Could we just talk a little bit about what's going to be happening this week? We're recording on February 24th. The French President Emmanuel Macron is scheduled to visit with Donald Trump today. Later in the week, the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer will be visiting. They're doing this in order to sequence arguments to Trump to not totally abandon Ukraine, but to also support the idea of a European peacekeeping force to somehow be a buffer along whatever lines of control are agreed to. This, says to me that the policy is still very much unformed. There will be apparently another meeting between the U.S. and Russia in Saudi this week as well. But so much is just unclear to me. So we have this, mineral deal that is going on that was presented to Zelensky last week. He turned it down. Then Keith Kellogg, the special envoy, visited at the end of last week, went to Kyiv, talked to Zelensky. It seemed like, Zelensky's going to sign the deal now, and that would get American buy-in to support Ukraine after a ceasefire. But Zelensky still hasn't signed because he still doesn't see the security guarantees he wants. And so we have that hanging out there. We have this European peacekeeping mission that's out there, which, of course, the Russians say they will not agree to anything that has European troops in Ukraine. And then we have this third track, which is the negotiating track over some type of ceasefire. So where this is headed, again, we just don't know. At the same time, the war is still going on. And what's interesting about the war is that the Russian war machine has slowed down quite a bit. I mean, it's this carnage that's slowly maybe gains a few square kilometers, every week or something. But it's not anywhere close to actually threatening the Kyiv government at this point.
And didn't Zelensky also try to call the bluff of the sort of accusation of him being a dictator by suggesting he would step down if that guaranteed NATO membership?
Yes, yeah. Give me NATO, I'll step down. Right. But no one's going to give him NATO, so he's not going anywhere.
But what strikes me about all this is that we're talking about Ukrainian concessions. I mean, if you consider the mineral deal a sort of concession that Zelensky is not willing to make, European obligations, peacekeeping forces. Is there any discussion of what Russia is supposed to concede here? Has that been floated at all? It reminds me very much of the talks around Israel and Gaza and Hamas, where everyone's talking about Netanyahu has said no to X, Y, and Z, while ignoring the fact that the responsibility for the war entirely is Gaza's. And there's something similar going on here in as regards Putin and Russia and American pressure on Zelensky.
I mean, the problem here is that there are only two things to negotiate with Putin over or demand from Putin that Trump basically conceded at the outset of talking about this. Like, one is withdraw, right? That's one. Withdraw some, withdraw all, and the other is stop the war. You stop the war unilaterally. Like, what other concessions are there?
Prisoners? Prisoners? Thousands of kidnapped Ukrainians?
Okay, fair enough.
That came up with in an interview that Trump had with Brian Kilmeade last Friday on the radio, where Brian Kilmeade pressed Trump on whether Ukraine started the war. And of course, Ukraine did not start the war. But he also brought up the Ukrainian children, who have been moved from the Russian-occupied Ukraine into Russia, and he asked Trump if he could do that, if he would demand that these children be returned to their homes. And Trump said, "That's a toughie. But interestingly enough, he also said, I just heard about that. So again, it's clear to me that the people who are telling him what's happening on the ground clearly have a certain worldview about this conflict, and that worldview does not talk about the atrocities and war crimes that have been visited on the Ukrainian people.
No, it's like governance by podcast. I mean, both in the foreign policy realm and now in the domestic realm, we have Dan Bongino having just been nominated to be number 2 at the FBI. And
Not
again,
nominated,
I have nothing against
not
podcasters.
Nominated, appointed, because this is
appointed,
not
right? Exactly. After promising Kash Patel and the and longtime FBI folks that they would have an internal candidate since Patel was an outsider, that obviously that not a promise kept. But I think Matt's onto something here that I think hasn't gotten enough attention. It got a ton of attention during the election. The power of podcasting to amplify Trump's message and how that contrasted with Kamala Harris's message. But in some sense, we miss the bigger picture, which is that he is taking his advice from people who podcast. And in many cases, these are folks who are distilling not even the wisdom of people who actually know what they're talking about, but a kind of populist vibe, a sort of feeling about foreign policy that certainly won Trump the election, but now makes it very difficult to understand the complications of the region. So
far be it for me to object to a president taking advice from a podcast.
No, I'm not objecting to it. I'm just noting that it seems.
I just you're right, and of course the whole point about podcasts or broadcasters or people like is that we're not exactly men in the arena, right?
We're amateurs.
The famous term, right? The Teddy Roosevelt's term, like it is the man in the arena, the one who actually risks it all to affect the course of history, that is the person who matters. And we're standing on the sidelines sort of reviewing the day's activities, and so does Tucker, and so does Megyn, so does Ben, so does Bongino, and so does Charlie Kirk, although in his other job he's doing political work for the Republicans and all of that. And Trump is eliding this difference between the man in the arena and the people who just blather from the sidelines. It's a little like, the whole plot of Bruce Almighty, which is like, there's Dan Bongino saying, the FBI stinks and everything's terrible. And then Morgan Freeman, okay, you run the FBI, like, all right, let's see how you do it. Except that, of course, we're all, the United States is going to have to live with what happens at the FBI under Kash Patel and Dan Bongino. Like, it's not just it's a comedy, Bruce Almighty, right? It's like, what if a loudmouth gets to have omnipotence?
What's interesting
loudmouth
about that, and I know we're jumping around here, but
sure,
there's just so much going on. Why not?
It's a podcast. We have
we're not in the arena
like Elon Musk, whom I want to talk about.
So something else that happened over the weekend was this kind of coordinated series of social media posts where President Trump said, "I love what Elon Musk and DOGE are doing, but they're not aggressive enough." And then Elon Musk, posted that Trump's tweet with kind of a salute saying, okay. And then later that day, this is Saturday, I believe, Office of Personnel Management, kind of, the HR department for the federal government, sent out an email to every federal employee asking them to list 5 things they had done the previous week. It's kind of a typical kind of, annual review type email you might get in the private sector, nonprofit sector. Tell us what you've been accomplished. And of course, the federal employees were very upset at this. But interestingly enough, the real pushback came from Trump's own administration. And as of today, Kash Patel told FBI agents not to respond. Pete Hegseth said to the Pentagon, don't respond. I saw that the State Department and Tulsi Gabbard said, don't respond to the intelligence community. So this is this is the first time I've seen some type of break happen within the administration. And no, it's not on the foreign policy stuff that we care about, but it's on DOGE. But it's worth noting
But it's
itself.
not DOGE, right? Because it's OPM, which is
Well,
not
but
DOGE.
it's directed
OPM
by
is now
DOGE.
controlled by DOGE.
And
Okay,
another interesting little fact that I came across this weekend is that in some of the responses to the lawsuits that have been filed against the Trump administration about some of these DOGE policies, the Trump administration is emphasizing that Elon Musk doesn't actually have the power that he is seeming to wield, at least when he talks about what he's doing. They're trying to downplay actually his authority in order to obviously continue the policies that they've enacted, but there's a strange kind of double game going on.
I also
here.
think to insulate him.
Right.
Well, no,
But his status is very unclear, but the DOGE people are government employees.
But there's a very, very specific legal thing happening here in relation to this claim in court papers that he is not an official employee of the U.S. government, only a consultant, which is, if he were, given the nature of the work he is doing, he should be defined as a senior officer of the executive branch and therefore should be a confirmed official. And this is something that's gone on. This was the entire argument over the setup of the, it's not the Consumer Product Safety, whatever the board that Elizabeth Warren created that has now been
Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Right, the consumer, which was created basically by an act of Congress in 2010, and Elizabeth Warren was going to be the head of it, and she couldn't get confirmed. Senate wasn't going to confirm her, and so they appointed somebody to run her. They were going to appoint her as an unconfirmed official, and the law, the sort of the ruling was, this has to be a confirmed position. Things are happening here that are definable under law as actions to enforce or deal with public spending and stuff like that. Complicated point, but so Musk has to be a consultant in order not to have his position, in order not to be somebody with the authority. He can only have the authority that he seems to be wielding if he's not actually working for the government, which is a paradox. I think you would have to agree, right? I mean, how can he fire people from the federal government when he doesn't work for the federal government? But in the private sector, there is this weird existence of the outside hitman who comes in and like fires people, sort of like it's like the plot of Up in the Air, Walter Curran's novel and the movie with George Clooney, where you hire a consultant who comes in, says to people, what did you name me the 5 things you did last week, which is a classic like McKinsey outside consultant thing to ask people, puts them on edge, very hostile, basically suggesting to them that what they do is not valuable unless they can themselves define what's valuable about it. And then those people come in and they fire, hundreds, if not thousands of people, give them the package, explain to them the separation proceedings, and then everybody in the company is somehow insulated from the need to basically cut the heads off their coworkers and people that they've known for years. But there are federal protections. There are protections in law, employment law, not only in the federal government, but also in the states and municipalities in which federal workers live and work, that make this, you can't just do it this way. I mean, you could try, you could see whether people will sort of give up the ghost, but they're not going to prevail. It's pretty open.
On what, shut. The OPM thing?
A lot. Well, the OPM thing, in other words,
the email seems to be a little bit trollish.
What they said was,
I think it was done to make sure. Musk said he did that to prove that many federal workers don't even check their email any longer. They don't.
Yeah, I heard that, and I had this thought, which made me realize it is completely trollish. Which is that I was thinking, from Monday 8 a.m. to Friday before Shabbos during waking hours, I'm almost never not working. And I ignore a lot of email.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with working. Email is like, oh, I'll get to that when I get to that. I have
Yeah.
actual work to do, you know?
Yeah.
So the idea that responding to email is synonymous with
Work.
getting work done
Yeah.
is a complete myth.
But what is important is that the OPM email said failure to respond to this email will be tantamount to a resignation. And that is legally, that is a non-starter. If you're going to fight, resignation is an act. An act of choice on the part of the person.
It's not a negative
design.
Right.
Nor can you say. I mean, you can say, I think, failure to respond to this email will be viewed as grounds for termination. In other words, the email can be an order,
but that's not what it was.
That can have a consequence. But that's not what it said. And the DOGE stuff, I mean, it's weird to say this because we're still only like a month and 4 days into this administration, like, is getting to be a mess. And, I don't know, like, it's very pleasing to a lot of people. There's a lot of it that I like and that a lot of people look at and say they like, but execution matters. If these guys are the best of the best, how they execute this transformation of the federal workforce is very significant. And don't think that you can't create a resistance movement against it pretty easily.
But they're actually, it's funny, we've been talking about them as like McKinsey consultants, about like HR types, but in fact they're acting like sysadmin, about like the tech admin in a big organization that kind of does a lot of stuff behind the scenes. They make you update, and your only connection with them is when they remind you, when they fix your computer, which you're always grateful for, when they remind you to update your password once a year, something like that. But there's a lot of stuff behind the scenes, both in terms of their access to information about how you spend your day, and also what they're telling, the boss in terms of what you're doing throughout the day. And so in that sense, I think it's less like Musk coming in acting as a consultant. He's like king of the sysadmin, and he's sending all his little guys out there, and they're going into and this is where I think the legal and privacy concerns that have been raised, and I think there are lawsuits pending about that, are substantial. So it's not just the style, it's that should someone who hasn't been confirmed and who is an outside consultant even have access to some of the information that him and his guys have. And I say all this I agree with you, John. There's a lot of waste in the federal government that it would be very nice to see done with. And in that sense, it's a real missed opportunity if he ends up kind of crashing around like a bull and and breaking all the china without really fixing the underlying government bloat.
But it seems it's like more about the hijinks. This is what, it's turning into. It's this sort of trolling, gimmicky hijinks thing. And the very fact that, Trump makes this announcement for Elon to go harder. Is that a real...
They clearly talked about it.
Right.
And it was like, hey, why don't you do this? And
right.
Then Trump did, and it's all cutesy.
It's another pro wrestling sort of move, And
that's like happening. I mean, we shouldn't discount, though, the fact that what DOGE has been up to is canceling millions and millions of dollars in contracts, right. And that's real. And
that is real. And there's but I mean this is where it gets complicated, in my view, in terms of what people on the right are failing to understand. Trump won almost a majority of the popular vote. He won by 1.5 points, which he hadn't in 2016, right? And he won a very convincing election, as we've said. The entire country moved to the right, even in places where Harris won. There were moves away from, there were 2 or 3 places where the country moved more democratic, and 99% of the country moved more in a rightward direction. All of that is real. The federal budget is $4 trillion. A lot of that money goes out from the federal government through the associated organizations at Health and Human Services and the Defense Department and others, in the form of grants and support for local programs and that sort of thing. And millions and millions and millions of people work under those conditions where the money flows from those contracts. And while suspending them for a couple of weeks to see, look under the hood and see what the hell is going on is one thing. And the idea people are saying that they're all being laid off immediately because the federal government closed off the spigot. I don't believe that to be the case.
Well, there are people who there's separate things. There's the spending freeze, which you're talking about.
Yeah.
Then there's the people that they have fired. They have
Right.
fired all these probationary employees. They have fired all these employees at AID.
Right.
And then just finally, there's the contracts.
Right, but that's what I wanted to talk about is the contracts and the grants, okay? So I'm not talking about federal workers. I'm now talking about the part of the economy that relies on government money for private employment, or, in part. And there's a lot of weird stuff going on where people are claiming they have to fire people because the spigot has been turned off or because there's been a spending freeze and contracts have been ended. And I'm suspicious of a lot of that because the money doesn't just shut off like a spigot, and people do have money in their bank accounts to pay people, or they have grants aren't given. It's not like a weekly salary you get from the federal government into your business and then you defray it to your employees. So I think a lot of trouble is being visited on these employees as part of an effort to create this mob of people who are going to say that what Trump is doing is terrible and is going to destroy healthcare, destroy our hospitals, destroy all of that. But it could work, you see. It really could work. Like, you could get circumstances in which we're going to start hearing horror stories about people being taken off, not enough ventilator. Whatever it is, horror stories that are real because real things are happening. Usually what happens is somebody proposes ending a federal program, and then there are stories about how the ending of that program is going to lead to terrible outcomes, and then Congress says, well, we're not going to end that program because of these possible terrible outcomes. Now you're actually going to get real horror stories and real dead people. Maybe they shouldn't be.
I would say that the horror stories we've gotten are mainly tied to USAID.
Right, which is not
which has no political constituency in the United States.
I agree
that sometimes,
yeah.
I'm sure if we went through line by line USAID, there'd be some things that I'd say, I think that's a good thing. But that's me living in my bubble.
Okay, but I'm now not talking about USAID.
I know now. What you're talking about are some things that are broader than that, and I don't think we have that yet. And I think you're right to say that's the danger. But I would say here's how the Trump administration and how the right views this, which is that the groups that you're talking about, these nonprofit groups that may be affected by some of the canceled contracts, there's no cost politically because those groups are not on the right. You're not alienating your own voters. You may energize the opposition, which is half the country. And so that would have some political costs, especially when you think about down the line in the 2026. But you're not actually hurting your own voters. I was having a conversation with a colleague about some contracts that have been canceled in the education space. And I was asking my colleague, the people receiving the money, I'm sure they're on the left, right? And he said, they're so far to the left that your woke New York Times reading grandma would think that they're to the left.
Right.
And so that type of story is not going to affect public opinion.
I totally
What you're
agree.
talking about is if farm subsidies are cut, if VA payments are cut, if Social Security and Medicare is cut. And that's, I think that's when Trump and the Republicans will say enough. But right now they don't feel that. They don't feel any pressure.
Okay, so we all know that NIH, the CDC, the organizations within the Department of Health and Human Services misbehaved terribly during COVID, right? We know that they were authoritarian, they were awful, they mistreated people, they tried to suppress speech, all of that, and going after them with a 2x4 is very emotionally satisfying. And on the other hand, like NIH gives out hundreds of billions of dollars of grant money to things that everybody does actually support, even though you think you don't, right? Certain types of cancer research, like all kinds of things that we do R&D on drugs and things like that. So I'm not talking about what's happening right now. I mean, in 2 months, you could have a world in which there is a very cleverly engineered mass set of claims being made about the Trump administration's reckless, not necessarily wrong. See, that's where it would be smart if they did this intelligently. Reckless, imprudent, like totalistic behavior on this spending when there's a lot of this spending that everybody likes. That if you did a poll and you said, do you think that we should be spending money to cure cancer? And 80% of people said yes. Then you would say, well, you know what? They canceled $100 billion in cancer research.
I don't know if that's true. We haven't seen them do that yet, right?
Well, we've seen the spending freeze on the one hand and contract cancellations on the other. And again, if there's not, we don't know what they're.
I'll just say that when I was editor of the Free Beacon, we had like a running feature about the ridiculous programs that the NIH funds.
Yeah. Right.
So that's not the cancer research. I agree with that.
Right.
Cancer research, you do that in an ad, it's going to harm people. But there's plenty of stuff that the NIH does that most people would read about and say, of course, that shouldn't do that. I will
not defend the NIH. I'm not defending.
So I want to just point out two things that I think should trouble the Republican Party, and they're not what they're along with the lines of what you're saying. The first is Medicaid. So when you think about the Trump coalition, many of its constituents rely on Medicaid. And there's an effort right now in order to block grant Medicaid as part of the Republican budget, which might be interpreted as cutting Medicaid because it would be given to the states. We should explain
what block granting is. First of all, Medicaid is already block granted. Medicaid is
it's a dual funding. Dual
funding. I mean, in other words, when Medicaid is
healthcare for the poor,
right? And generally speaking, it's half of it comes from the federal government, and then half of it comes from the states,
right? And so Republicans,
that's how it works.
For many years, want to treat Medicaid like we treat welfare under the welfare reform of 1996, which is we just give a big pile of money to the states and say you deal with it what you want. We're not going to be consistently funding it. Now, some states would say, great, we don't want to spend all this money. We want to do our own thing. And that could result in cuts. And that could hurt the Trump coalition, which many of its voters are participate in Medicaid, even rely on it. The other thing that, and I'm, breaking the Republican commandment of always wanting to cut taxes here by saying this, is that it is any tax package that goes through, and of course that's a roll of the dice whether it happens or not. If the corporate tax cuts and the small business tax cuts and the upper income tax cuts are emphasized, if Democrats seize on those to the exclusion of the standard deduction preserving the lower taxes that the 2017 tax cut bill included, that would hurt Trump too. It's often forgotten, but one of Trump's weakest moments of his presidency was December 2017, when he signed the tax cut into law. So I think those are the potential danger spots right now. And then underlying it all, of course, is the inflation number. That's where he has to think about. But the contracts, the federal workers, I think that's less of a concern.
Okay, so let's just move on. I want to talk about Musk for a minute because I noticed something this weekend.
The chainsaw?
Well, yeah. Okay, so yeah, he stood on the stage at the CPAC conference and waved around a chainsaw while he was wearing sunglasses, but Sunday, I think he tweeted 90 or 100 times on Sunday.
Ketamine is a hell of a drug, John.
I mean, it seemed very, very, very manic. And I'm, not a doctor.
He couldn't form sentences at CPAC.
Yeah.
I tried watching that interview. I only could get through half of it because Elon wasn't saying anything.
Yeah. I mean, he is up all night. He tweets in the middle of the night. He's, on this tear. He's not, he suddenly has a 13th child. He's not the most stable person. Now, I am on record as being an unvarnished admirer of his as an industrialist, as an inventor, as a figure in business. I think he's remarkable. That doesn't mean that he's remarkable doing what he's doing right now. And it doesn't mean that it means that while he can do whatever he wants on Twitter, he owns Twitter. He can do whatever he wants at CPAC. He's got free speech rights. He can do it. But that doesn't mean that he's going to be a net positive for this presidency or in the job that he is doing for this presidency, whether Trump likes it or not. And there are, I think, little bits of signs that whatever good that he may have done in Trump's terms, and Trump saying, hey, get even tougher, are going to run into the problem of his personal behavior, making him seem like a crazy person, and that he is got the government in his hands. And that is going to be very valuable. People forget how successful the demonization of Republican reformers has been throughout our lifetimes. People who come on and say, I'm not going to abide by all these niceties. We're going to do X, Y, and we're changing the way things work. And it's one thing if that's the president who has been elected to break things, right? And he can hire underlings who are also supposed to break things. But Newt Gingrich was an elected official, and he became the means by which Bill Clinton sort of boomeranged himself back into relevance and into power in 1995 by overreaching and misbehaving. And he was a more credible figure as a political leader than Musk is. But Musk could be a gift to Trump's enemies if he doesn't calm the hell down.
But this is where the midterms will be a very fascinating test of all of this, because among all the interviews that were being done at CPAC, a lot of, very enthusiastic MAGA Trump supporting Elon loving folks said, we don't care about the midterms. A real leader doesn't care about their poll numbers. And that's, of course, a huge mistake, because Trump won with a lot of new voters in the coalition, not hardcore MAGAs, but people who just wanted to escape what they saw as the deterioration economically and internationally of our country, and just didn't trust the Biden-Harris regime. If he alienates that's a very fickle group of voters, and we will see what they feel if this sort of the churn that Musk and Trump are initiating here actually falls out, because the hardcore people say you got to break eggs to make an omelet. That's what I mean. You hear that over and over about Musk's approach, and they're not going to budge. But it's those other voters that he will need in the midterm, or the Republican Party will need in the midterms.
Go ahead, Dave.
Trump obviously loves Musk's persona at the moment. I mean, this is why he's doing interviews with him. He's telling him in public to go harder. Why? I think Trump enjoys that Musk is absorbing the criticism that would otherwise be aimed directly at him for now. I also think that if Trump senses that Musk becomes a genuine liability, he will throw him under the bus in 2 seconds.
Right. I mean, I think right now Trump and MAGA are riding high. They're still flexing their muscles. They've been in office for a month. This Trump revolution is taking place domestically and internationally. Trump's approval rating in the Real Clear Politics average of polls is still above water. We have to just take a step back and say, okay, how did this play out the first time? Well, the first time Trump had 4 chiefs of staff, 4 national security advisors, and 4 secretaries of defense, a new one every season. And so it's just, I think, beggars belief that he will end his term with the same team as he has right now. and we just don't know what will be the events or the developments that will cause some type of shakeup. And I think that applies to Musk as well. Remember, the original mandate for DOGE is just 2 years. It actually ends right with the midterm elections. And there already then we're kind of have a DOGE type countdown. It's also, we should think, Musk too might get bored at some point and might want to do something else.
So there are two things, Christine's point about the midterms and making a mistake saying that about the midterms. So there's one counterexample. Actually, there are two counterexamples. Reagan and Clinton. So Reagan had a terrible first midterm in 1982, lost, Democrats gained 26 seats in the House, and they had already been very much in the majority, and lost a couple of seats in the Senate, having gotten the majority in the Senate. And the idea was that Reagan was playing a longer game, right? They initiated all these. They were very painful. There was a terrible reset. The Fed was adjusting interest rates, 20 times in 2 years, up, down 2 points, down 50 basis points, up a basis, whatever. And the idea was they were doing what they could to kill inflation, and then the tax cuts would start working while inflation was going down, and it worked. And so by the early 1984, the economy was like exploding, and Reagan won 49 states. So there are grounds on which to ignore the midterms if you have a long-term plan where you're going to kill inflation and then spur economic growth with a program, and then the country will decide by 1984 whether it worked or not. That's what we don't. There's too much improvisation here. We don't know if Trump had a plan to kill inflation and then grow the economy.
He hasn't been talking about the price of eggs much lately.
At all. Right. And that, of course, was the only subject in America in 1981, because inflation got to, interest rate got to 18%. Inflation was incredibly high. Anyway, my point is that, there are good reasons to ignore the midterm. Now, it's not that Clinton ignored the midterms in 1994. It's that the midterms then provided him with a kind of opportunity to zing back, and the economy exploded also. Not really because of things that he did. I don't think he deserves credit for it, but he did take advantage, and then he, of course, won re-election. So there are historical grounds on which to say we don't need to pay attention to the midterms because we're after bigger fish, which is realignment.
It's like Trotsky said of war. You might not be interested in the midterms, but the midterms are interested in you, because if the Democrats capture the House next year, they only have to, I think, net 3 or 4 seats to do so.
If that,
they'll impeach Trump. And just all the investigations, everything we saw last time, the precedent will be actually 2018, because it's almost impossible, it looks like, for the Democrats to win the Senate next year. So you'd have the same thing. Trump didn't really work with the Democrats in the House, we might say, in his last 2 years in his first term, and we would expect that to begin. But I do think, I know I'm like a broken record here. It's way too early.
No, but it's way too early. Right.
Inflation is a combination of Trump's energy policies and then the supply side reforms on deregulation and taxes. That's how you get through the inflation. And so far, we're only at the very beginning of the energy policy. So you're not going to see results for some time.
No, I'm literally saying that Trump and the Republicans could be saved. Now, you're saying they'll be in trouble because of the behavior of the Democrats in the House. I'm saying that the Republican Party as a whole, if Trump's long-term economic policies bear fruit, but it takes until the 3rd and 4th years for them to bear fruit, Republicans will benefit. That's what history tells us. You can't avoid the truth of that. So there is something to be said for the play the long game. Don't worry about the don't be, we're going to lose the midterms. But
he's a lame duck. He's playing a different sort of long game.
I'm saying the Republicans.
Okay.
I'm saying the entire Republican Party will benefit from, they went with Trump. Trump turned the economy around, and the Democrats said everything they did was wrong. So that's actually something that they can take to the bank if they will. I think that the thing with Musk in the end is that he is the richest man in the world and an incredibly inventive industrialist. And he is like enjoying, I don't know how to put it, it's like in the world of popular culture, a person like him who is like a Bond villain level, like in control of everything behind the scenes thing, would be way more arrogant, way calmer, way more, he's like on a manic high. It's like he's already, what does he need? He needs to get into Twitter fights with Neil Ferguson, or like, he's like accusing nobodies with 200 followers of being liars on Twitter and cursing them out and that sort of thing. Like, really, doesn't he have bigger fish to fry? Go catch a rocket with another rocket. Like, I don't understand. It's not a good sign about his behavior as a public official that it jazzes him so much. Like, it's like there's no focus. He doesn't have sort of like a calm, deliberate approach here, which is like, I know what I'm doing. I'm better at this than anybody else. He's just flying off the handle. And I do think that means that Trump, if things start to leach over to Trump, Trump will say, you did great. Thanks he'll say what he said to Chris Christie when Chris Christie endorsed him and then was like standing on platforms with him. And then he said, go home. The plane's waiting for you. Go home.
He'll give him a nickname. Yeah. He'll give Elon a nickname, a negative one.
Trump hasn't really broken out any new names lately.
Yeah, the nickname thing seems to be
kind of over. Yeah. For now,
yeah, I'm sure it'll come back like a hit.
He's moved from the nicknames to the dance. That's kind of the progression of MAGA so far. It's like you need nicknames when you're kicking down, but now that you're on top, you're dancing.
Fair enough. Okay, I'm going to make a recommendation. We haven't made one in a couple of days, and it's a surprise to me because I really didn't think well of the first 2 seasons of this show. But Amazon, I think on Thursday, released the first either 2 or 3 episodes of the 3rd season of Reacher. This is the adaptation of the Lee Child novels about the sort of the Lone Ranger of our time, a former MP Special Forces guy who sort of travels America alone without a bank account or money or anything like that, and kind of finds himself in the middle of problems that only he can solve with his giant.
I was going to say him and his pecs. They can solve any problem.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, the 2nd season of the show was terrible. It made a terrible mistake because it focused on Reacher as part of a team, which is not what Reacher is. And so it was Reacher and his team, and it was really bad. This season, which is based on a Reacher novel called Perdition.
Persuader.
Persuader. Sorry.
Which is possibly my favorite of the novels.
Right. Anyway, it is really good. Fantastic supporting performances, one by Anthony Michael Hall, famously the geek in 16 Candles, who is now, a buff 6'1" guy who goes and gets arrested for beating people up in his condo in Orange County. So he's not the guy you think of when you think of Anthony Michael Hall as a teenager, but he's sort of playing this weird rug merchant who looks like he's the big bad, but he isn't really. There's a big bad behind him, and Reacher is working with these cops in Maine, one of whom is played by an absolutely fantastic actress named Sheila Cassidy, and it's really violent and really tough, and Reacher is back to being really tough and hard ass, and it's well written and well acted and well conceived, and so it's actually it's not only is it a return to form. I mean, it's better than the first season also, which also made the mistake of being about Reacher and his family ties and his late brother. about whom he seemed to have no emotional feeling whatsoever when the whole thing starts with his brother getting killed, and he goes to figure out what happened to his brother, who doesn't seem to matter to him one way or the other. Anyway, so Reacher season 3 on Amazon. Anybody else watch any of it yet?
No.
Okay. Anyway,
but I love the book. Persuader is a really good Lee Child novel.
Yeah.
I love that you didn't like the first full 2 seasons and watched.
Right.
That's
why I haven't tuned
anyway.
in, because I didn't care for the first 2 seasons either.
It's weird. I did
He
this.
persists, Abe. He persists.
Apparently.
I did this with Botch also. Well, because I like the books, so
Yeah,
the
books are
Botch,
amazing.
which they made 7 or 8 seasons out of, which was unbelievably boring. It was the most boring cop show I have ever seen.
It's a slow burn.
It's sort of like, let's go get a hot dog, and then they spend 10 minutes at a hot dog stand, and nothing happens. Like
you're saying there's action in this season of Reacher.
There's action, and it is got that Reacher, thing, which is the world is a really dangerous place. Right. And bad people do really bad things and are terrifying at what they do. And sometimes you need, a sort of avenging angel to come into your town and make things right, which is the theme of the books and of this 3rd season of Reacher. So yes, I'm recommending the 3rd season and disrecommending the first 2 seasons. And this guy, Alan Ritchson, who plays Reacher, it's so comic because, of course, Tom Cruise made 2 movies as Reacher, and he's, 5'2" and weighs 11 pounds. And it was always like, what on earth were you people thinking? And Ritchson has rebalanced this appropriately. Anyway, we'll be back tomorrow for Matt, Christine, and Abe. I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.